This program is presented by University of California Television. Like what you learn? Visit our website or follow us on Facebook and Twitter to keep up with the latest UCTV programs.
Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Chrysler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Tanya Marie Luhrmann, who is the Watkins University professor in the Stanford Anthropology Department. Her books include Persuasions of the Witchcraft, The Good Parsi, Of Two Minds, and When God Talks Back. Professor Luhrmann, welcome to Berkeley.
Thanks, it's great to be here.
Where were you born and raised?
I was born in Dayton, Ohio, because my dad was in the Air Force. But I was actually raised on the East Coast in New York City and outside in New Jersey.
And you mentioned in one of the introductions the influence of your grandfather, who was a Baptist minister. Talk a little about that, because later we'll talk about your book on the Evangelicals.
He was just such a lovely man. And I still have this vivid memory of him taking me on his shoulders as we walked across the park. And it somehow melds with a memory in my mind about St. Christopher carrying the baby Christ child. And I don't want to sort of draw an analogy between myself and Christ, but between my grandfather and St. Christopher, as somebody who was just, he was just that person who would take care of you. He was a very adventurous man. He was polylingual. He was a missionary in Burma. He didn't, unlike my grandmother, he wasn't so eager to convert. He was eager to learn languages. He loved to get on the back of an elephant and go into the jungle and pull teeth for people and to do sort of simple medical work. He and my grandmother both taught school in this mountainous area of what was then Burma, and told stories. He was a real kind of an adventure buff, and he died too young, but he died off exploring in his later 60s, which at that age was kind of old to get an RV and drive off into the desert and cruise around. And I always thought that there was something kind of wonderful about that, about kind of living your life to the fullest, to the last.
Where did you do your undergraduate work?
I was at Harvard.
Mm-hmm. And what did you major in?
Folklore and mythology.
Mm-hmm. So you were an anthropologist or an anthropology major?
I was not. Mm. So folklore was its own program. There was this great professor called Albert Lord, who was partially responsible for the Lord-Parry hypothesis, the Parry-Lord hypothesis about the making of oral epics and how they were kind of created. There was a sort of implicit grammar to the way that the singer of tales put together his story. And so because of Lord, there was this kind of odd, idiosyncratic, and quite wonderful undergraduate major, which introduced you to the literature of folklore and to the ways that certain classic questions about how to understand these myths and stories that people tell to themselves. And I loved it. I actually came to college with the idea that I would be a philosopher. And this next story is about what it is like to be 17, but it's, I remember reading Kant and thinking that this was cheating. He saw a puzzle that he wanted to explain, which was that people thought in similar ways and very, robustly from person to person, and he solved it by just asserting that there were categories of the understanding. And I thought that was kind of interesting, but I also thought it didn't I thought that people were really complicated, and I wanted to know about the differences between people, and I also wanted to know about the stories they told themselves, and I thought that those stories were at least as important as any categories of the understanding through which we grasped our world.
And then where did you do your graduate work?
At the University of Cambridge in the UK.
And who did you work under there? Or?
My formal advisor was Ernest Gellner. I actually started working with Stephen Hugh Jones, but he left for the Amazon partway through my time there, and Ernest was just arriving. So, so it was a wonderful match. I mean, Ernest is an anthropologist, but also half a philosopher. He thought about the rational and the mythical, and the way that people are and are not logical and means ends directed in organizing their life, and the way that these variations are framed in different social groups. Geoffrey Lloyd was also a very important influence. He's a classicist who tries to understand what he calls the mentalities. That was a word that was in vogue at the time. Trying to understand how do you make sense of the fact that the Greeks, came up with what we now call science. Was it scientific to them? What did it mean for them to use an experimental method? How did we understand that? And so both of them were great at asking questions and pushing me and arguing with me. It was a great education.
I get the sense that, especially in your earlier years, but then later also, there's a real sense of distancing yourself as an observer, but also embedding yourself, at the same time, and sort of a respectful sense of the stories that people tell themselves as they belong to these groups. But that seems to be present in your very early years.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I've never had much physical courage. I like to drive slowly on the freeway. I don't climb mountains, but I really find it fascinating to try to figure out how somebody else thinks. So I tend, in general, not to be so frightened by ways of thinking that seem very different to other people. And I think that what it takes to be a good anthropologist is this capacity to empathically connect and also stand back. So on the one hand, you are embedded enough so that you can feel it when the magic shoots through your body, or when, and I've never really had this sense, part of what I do is I study psychotic distress, people who are really disconnected from reality, and you can't really have a true grasp of that experience, but grasp it enough to have a feel for the way people describe it. But you also need to kind of be standing back and saying, oh, what happened? Why did I feel the magic shoot through my body? How would I explain that as, putting the magic aside, what's going on in the body, what's going on in the mind, what's going on in the social world in which I was embedded that enabled me to have such an experience?
Mm-hmm. And you are both an anthropologist and a psychological anthropologist.
That's right.
So is the skill set the same for both, or do they complement each other and bring different skills to the table?
I think to be a psychological anthropologist, so that's an anthropologist with one foot in the psychological domain, you're interested in emotions and in thinking and in the structure of the mind, the way people carve up the world cognitively. So you really have to be pretty comfortable with sitting and listening to people talk about themselves. You also have to be really comfortable with ambiguity and failure. So one of the things that I find so striking about trying to understand how people experience God, for example, is that you never know. You can learn an awful lot, but real understanding is just always disappears over the horizon because people are so complicated. The meaning, language is remarkably important, but it's in ways a flimsy vehicle for conveying anything as complicated as somebody's experience of God. And so the more that you come to understand how somebody subjectively experiences their world, you need to tolerate that you can grasp only a tiny portion of what they do.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of temperament, for somebody who's doing both of these things, anthropology, it sounds like self-confidence is important. Is that the right word? Or because you're moving between worlds and moving out of worlds.
Well, I find that self-confidence is nice. It's a good thing to have in life. You need to be robust enough to come back to yourself. But I think the skill that you really need is the ability to kind of, seek to identify with somebody else. And so there's actually a funny way in which the good anthropologist, I think this is true for all anthropologists, but really particularly for people who are really trying to understand not the structure of the agricultural life, but what it's like to live in somebody else's skin. When you're talking to somebody, you're always there's a piece of you that's trying to figure out what it's like to be them. And so there's almost as if you have a time delay in the way that you're responding to people. So I think it's not unrelated to being the skills of being an actor, I think, except that it's almost the opposite. I think actors are, become very conscious of who they are in the room. And the anthropologist more needs to have this negative capability, the sense of being aware, always thinking about what it would be like to be somebody else. And so again, you've got to tolerate limitations, because who knows what it's like to actually live in somebody else's skin. But it's more like the novelist's skills. You're trying to, except you're constrained by the fact that you're not making it up. You're sitting with real people and you're trying to figure out what it is like to write a ritual, sit with somebody who's psychotic, if you're a young psychiatrist, what it's like to pray. And so you yourself can learn a little bit about that by praying and sitting with people who are psychotic, or writing a ritual, but you never quite know. So you always have the sense that you're triangulating from many, many different sources of information. And you're trying to help yourself to construct a sense of what this different world is like. You're trying to lay out the steps that it would take somebody who wasn't from that world to sort of go native to some extent in that world. And then you, the anthropologist, have to kind of be able to do that and come back.
And you come back and you record and analyze. And one of the remarkable things about your work is it's very hard to put your books down because they're so well written. So you said novelist, like a novelist. So in other words, the book that comes out is not a novel, but you're carrying forward what you've learned.
Right. And one of the things that you're trying to do is tell this story in a way that's true to the people that you're describing, but also makes them come alive to the people who are reading. So you have you, the anthropologist, know what this world is like. You then try to set it down in prose, and that's often, it's really a sobering experience to spend 3 hours in an evening doing with a group of people and then come back and you try to write it down for 3 hours. And my goodness, there's all this stuff that just drops out. And what remains is that, skeletal structure that you've sketched out. And so what you're trying to learn to do is to use your words to evoke, to capture, to point, to get people to get some sense of what it's like. And it's so interesting reading ethnographies. The good old-fashioned ethnographies were kind of wonderful because they were written with the idea that nobody who was reading them had ever been to, say, Africa. So I was studying at Cambridge. Most of the people I was reading had done their fieldwork in Africa. And so the books were full of these descriptions of, red earth and a hot sun that, the reader hadn't experienced before. And I find one of the challenges of writing about a world that people know is that, you write about evangelical Christianity. People know a lot about evangelical Christianity, and yet, in some sense, often they know nothing. And so it's a slightly different writerly challenge. And so it's an interesting challenge.
And the good writing would seem to be important because as an anthropologist and a field worker, you're having, we've already said, to be respectful of the community, but then you have to capture that and not embed it in jargon.
Right.
Really, because otherwise you will lose the empathy that you have had and you won't convey it to the reader who also has to empathize, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
So what was your dissertation on? Let's go back to your graduate education.
Well, I was on I called it Science or Children, Offspring of Prospero. It was about these middle-class folks, mostly middle-class folks in London, who practiced what they called magic and witchcraft. I'd been reading Evans Pritchard and all these anthropological accounts of people in pre-literate settings who practiced witchcraft and magic, and I had a lot of ideas about magic. And on my way off to graduate school, I picked up a book in the Harvard bookstore that told you how to be a witch. Kind of described. It was kind of great. It was written by somebody in Berkeley. And
was there a degree in?
No, there were, well, not in that. Not she wasn't describing one, but it turned out that there was. Mm-hmm. So I was just floored by this description of being a witch, being a magician in this modern, sophisticated, complicated world. And I thought it would be really interesting to try to understand how magic became compelling to somebody and how it seemed real to people who had been brought up, in theory, in a very post-magical, very modern, even postmodern, scientifically sophisticated world. And so I went searching for this in England. So here I was at Cambridge, and I was sharing this book to people and chatting about it. And somebody finally said, "Oh, a friend of a friend of a friend of a friend of mine is a witch. You ought to give her a call." And so I called her up and said, "Hi, I'm a Cambridge anthropologist, and I'm interested in witchcraft. I hear you're a witch. Can I come talk to you?" And I went out to see her, and it turned out that she was a great woman. She also brewed her own wine, which was pretty intense, and vintage was about 3 weeks. And so it was, that was a little tough. But she was fascinating. And she introduced me to a whole world of people who were, on the one hand, sophisticated, well-educated, some with Cambridge degrees, and on the other hand, practicing magic. And this was a world that thought that there were different kinds of reality. There was the material world, and then there's other stuff. And this other stuff has power. And you can use your mind to harness it, direct it, push it in different directions so that you can get the house next door, cure your back problem, bring truth into English politics, all kinds of stuff. And that's what I did. I tried to make sense of how what these folks were doing was persuasive to them.
And you point out, actually, and I think this is a point you make in several of your books, is that we live in a complex world, generally,
right,
in which we're very uncertain and ambivalent about the meaning of things. And this is a defining condition for many of the communities you look at. So they're trying to come to term with their own ambivalences about the world, and they recognize those ambivalences.
And I think what I was really aware of was how complicated these commitments to the supernatural were. And it's not that people aren't clear about what they believe, but that they, even although they might believe that the magic is real or that God is real, in some ways that's always a conditional commitment, even though they really believe it. And if you think about it, any church service is surprisingly work intensive. I mean, think of the amount of effort we go to build a church. We spend a lot of money, a lot of time. We build this huge thing, and then we fill it with, sense and music and people and all this. If people took for granted, and it was not at all a question of whether God existed, you wouldn't have to do all that stuff. And there's a way in which God is really real for people, the magic's really real for people, but they're also making God real and making the magic real at the same time. And particularly in a sophisticated world like London or the South Bay or East Bay, whatever, people know that there are other people who have very different understandings of the world. They encounter people who believe different things about the ultimate, and they can't but be aware of those differences. You can't write all of those people off as crazy. And if you take some of them as being sensible people, then you have this, what do you do with that? And so that was one of the things I was trying to understand, how people allowed their fundamental commitments to be alive to them.
And you found that there was, in the ritual and the apparatus of magic, something that was reminiscent of religion. There was
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And what I saw, I really began, remember I was going to graduate school back in the days of the linguistic turn, and we were going to understand everything with language, and I didn't even have the tools of cognitive science to articulate it then, but I thought that what I was going to do when I wandered into this magical world and I tried to understand it, I thought I was going to be looking for and identifying and sketching out words, metaphors, representations, narratives that people would acquire. So you'd be a non-magician, you'd start hanging out in these magical worlds, and you would acquire a way of thinking about the world that would just reshape your way of explaining events. And that I certainly found those. But what I also found was that the magicians were very clear. So these were people who met in groups of between 10 and 100, and they would do these rituals, and the rituals would involve running around and whatever, but they'd really involve shutting your mind, visualizing something powerfully, and allowing the power, however you understand that, to come through your mind and go out into the world. People were very clear that if you were going to do magic, you had to practice. And the practices were things like, I did take a course in magic, 9-month course, with, with what was called a supervisor. I wrote essays, they were graded, and I had an exercise. So 15 minutes a day, I had to sit in my room, shut my eyes, and imagine in my mind's eye that I was flying through the air. I was going to this garden in the sky. I was building in that garden an altar with a chalice and whatever else. I was planting the garden, and it was for me my own magical altar on which I could do rituals that would change the world. And so 15 minutes a day, I had to do these practices, which involved basically shutting my eyes and imagining stuff. People were very clear that if you wanted to practice magic, you had to do those exercises. And what floored me is that the exercises worked. And by that, I mean that they changed me. So I began to feel, I never felt I was leaving my body to fly to this garden, but I felt different. The garden got more and more powerful, sort of realistic. I had a couple of striking experiences. I felt magic move through my body, and I really felt it. You know, I'm kind of like, I'm not making an ontological claim here about the reality of magic, but I felt that move through my body. I was in a ritual and I saw God. You know, not externally in the world, but I saw God in my mind's eye. This particular God who was a sort of a horned God and a kind of sort of James George Frazer kind of, you know, ancient people's God. I woke up one morning and I saw 6 druids standing by the window. And so I saw them. It was actually you'd call it technically a hallucination. It's not so hard to have them between sleep and awareness, but it turns out they're kind of common. But it was very striking to me. And I was reading this book that was written by a witch called The Mists of Avalon, all about the Arthurian Arthurian story. And other people would report these experiences as well. It wasn't like it was just me. People would say things like, oh, I saw the goddess. It was the most amazing experience. I looked into the mirror and there she was. And it wasn't me. I saw something. They would talk about hunting on the astral plane. And sometimes it was pretty clear they had a powerful experience. Goodness knows how you make sense of that, again, ontologically, what's really happening. But they had these powerful experiences. And so I realized that if I was ultimately really going to understand that, I'd have to start understanding these changes that happened to people as a result of these practices they did. And over the decades, I came to look at what the witches were doing more carefully. It looks an awful lot like Christian prayer.
So the important point here, which you actually carry into other studies, is that it's just to repeat what you're saying, that it's not necessarily belief or ideas, but it's really the practice of doing, in this case, magic,
right,
that in some way helps shape your mind.
Yes.
So that in a way, some of what's going on here sounds like a novelist, basically, in a way, you know, for the people who are actually doing the stuff.
Absolutely. So in some sense, I see myself as doing a sort of social anthropology of the mind, looking at the way that people use practices and ideas within a certain social world to micro-construct their subjective experience and to shift their psychological responses. So, you know, humans have a certain packet of psychological capacities, but the practices, the social practices in which those humans are located, and the way that they attend to their inner experience during religious and other practices really changes their experience in pretty powerful ways. So when I think about my contribution to anthropology, I think about the way that culture really gets under your skin and changes your experience profoundly.
Mm-hmm. And it's important here that magicians hang around with magicians,
Absolutely.
right? So they're getting the communal support that reinforces this.
Absolutely. I mean, you can do some of these techniques by yourself, read a bunch of books, sort of carry your community with you in the form of printed words, but it's much more powerful when you're with a group of like-minded people who are practicing certain things together. One of the most amazing things I saw when I was hanging out in the magical world were people who almost went on voyages in their mind together. So you would see people, and we have records of people who would sit together and they would relax and they would describe to each other what they were seeing in their mind's eye. And so they were describing it so that other people in the group could have this experience. And when the group was skilled and small enough, people could take on the story from each other, and they would have together this shared experience that was also an imagined experience, or at least they were using their imagination to experience it. And I thought that was fascinating.
You have a line here that was one of two lines that I thought were really. You say of the 1960s, people discovered tarot cards at about the same time as they discovered bean sprouts. Actually,
Yes.
so in other words, it's a phenomena that's sort of generally out there in the world, but these communities take a particular form, actually.
Absolutely. So one of the things, the big thing that happened in the 60s is that the ordinary middle-class life blew open, and people began to search for the spiritual in new ways. They do that in Christianity in particular ways. They did it outside of Christianity in particular ways. They were using some of the same techniques, and they were all searching for something that was more palpably real to them than God had been in the standard mainstream churches of the 50s.
Mm-hmm. Now, before you did the work on the Evangelicals, you worked on psychiatrists.
Right.
And psychiatrists are a community that, in the end, finds illness and disease in some of what you're dealing with, namely what
Right.
people have in their minds and how their practice changes their minds.
Yeah.
So how did you come to work on psychiatrists, and what did you find?
So it's sort of the other side of my interest in religion. So when people embrace a religion, they are seeking to change their mental world in particular ways, often to make themselves, this is not the whole point of religion, but I think that you could think of religion as an emotion management and mind management system that changes the way you experience yourself. It seeks to calm your anxious voices, give you a sense of confidence that you're loved, that you're doing good in the world, whatever. Mental illness is the other side of that story. There are ways in which people's minds get out of control. The anxious voices don't quiet down. They sometimes hear people speak, and people aren't speaking. They are horribly depressed. They feel anguish. And the way we think about, the book on psychiatry is really about the observation that the way that we think about the mind changes some of the mental experience. And it was really, and the vehicle for thinking about that more deeply was watching young psychiatrists come to terms with what mental illness was from two different perspectives. I was in that world at a time when there was tension between the biomedical model and the psychodynamic model. So there were both, scientists in white coats who were, in lab coats, who thought of themselves as curing illness by giving medication, and illness was disease. And there were folks who were, wearing tweed jackets and talking about emotional suffering and trying to help people manage their own sense of distress through developing a better relationship with somebody else. And so that was my vehicle, to watch the way that young psychiatrists came to understand mental illness from two different perspectives, and the way that and how differently those perspectives represented mental illness.
And in the choice about the kind of psychiatrist you were was also socially based, basically, right? In other words, because the work of medicine was changing, you were getting
Right.
insurance plans that may want
Right.
to pay for pills, but not for extended
Right.
psychoanalysis.
Right. And so, residencies where young psychiatrists are trained were shifting rapidly, and there was an expectation that you would find your meal ticket by prescribing medication rather than conducting psychotherapy. That's changed a little now, and different places, emphasized one more than the other. But there were still these two different models of psychiatry in any residency, and you could see the way they interacted. You could see the way that people tried to make sense of them. And I could see that the loss of psychoanalysis, I thought, was hard on patients, and the rise of the purely what I'll call the vulgar biomedical model was hard on patients. And then eventually I went off and started studying people who were struggling with serious psychotic disorder as well.
And you say at one point here, biology is the great moral loophole for our age.
Yeah, thank you. I think it is. I mean, we think increasingly, if we have a body-based vision of human action, then nobody's choosing to act in an immoral way. It simply happens. You were addicted to gambling, for example. You were psychotic and so not responsible for a crime you may have committed. You committed suicide because you were depressed. You didn't choose to do it. And I think that it's just striking particularly when you have a vulgar, I mean, I don't think that most psychiatrists hold a vulgar biomedical model, but particularly at the height of that excitement about discovering that drugs would affect psychiatric illnesses, there was a sense that, we were all just biochemical, airbags, and you could kind of move the bag this way or move the bag that way, but it didn't have anything to do with human choice or intention or will.
So in the book, you wind up really focusing on the psychiatrists,
Yeah.
but not on the mentally ill.
That's right. So
right.
There was only a last chapter in which I talked about the cost to patients. And I thought that the cost was greatest to the most ill patients. If you have somebody with depression, serious depressive disorder, relatively common experience for folks, if you attribute that depression not to anything that anybody did or not to any way in which you were disappointed by somebody else's action, but you simply see it as a brainstorm, and you take a medication and the depression goes away, you're fine. You don't have to think about morality at all. You don't have to think about anyone's responsibility. You don't have to think about yourself as a choosing agentic person. You come back to baseline. You don't have to worry about the disorder. If you think about a serious illness like schizophrenia as a matter of a broken brain, you remove all moral personhood from that person because their brain is broken and they're never going to get back to baseline. Then it turns out that that's a little exaggerated. Some people do come back to baseline. Many more people recover than we, in fact, give them credit for doing. But in representing people who are chronically ill as having faulty brains, we just take their selfhood away from them.
It's interesting because in a way, in this book, you are observing the observers,
Right.
and you are looking at how they learn to judge what is wrong with this particular patient, and their choices about what's wrong with this patient are affected by their training.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
So in a way, it would seem to be taking another cut at this problem of observing and being respectful of a body of people who, in this case, are ill.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't holding psychiatry to blame. I was thinking about these great cultural shifts that shaped the way that people think about the body and think about the soul and think about other persons.
Next, you did a book on evangelicals.
I did.
Was that hard to get into, or was that something that your background made easier?
Well, I was always puzzled by the power of the response I saw to people training to be magicians. I wanted to understand it more deeply. And one of the things I learned from hanging out with psychiatrists is that there were ways to ask those questions more deeply. And I acquired more psychological sophistication in thinking about the way that certain practices changed your mental experience. And so I did this project, I in part motivated because the kinds of things that the Christians said to me was very much the kinds of things that the witches said to me, which is, the Christian said, if you want to know God, you've got to pray. Prayer is hard, and it's going to take work, and it will change you. Some people will change more than others. And they talked about that change in ways that was quite similar to the way that the witches talked about change. In some ways, what they said was very different. They would also say, that there's a whole, theological language that the witches and magicians did not use. But they would even sometimes say that prayer practice led to sharper mental imagery, and that was very interesting. That wasn't, that's not the kind of thing that you say because you want to signal that you're a pious person. And so that's what led me into that world, trying to understand. I felt I'd learned something from the psychiatric work that would help me to think more deeply about the puzzle I was left with as the result of the magical work. And I thought I could begin to solve that puzzle, or explain that puzzle, by looking at evangelicals. And one of the things that's really clear about evangelical Christianity is you can't say that they're a bunch of oddballs the way you can say about witches. You could say that witches aren't very important. I mean, who's a witch? Arguably more people in Berkeley than other parts of the world, but it's like you can't say to a group that constitutes something like 40% of the American population, these are oddballs. You have to take their experience seriously.
Now, how did you go about studying it? Did you actually join a church, become a participant in a church? And which church?
So I joined something called I went to the Vineyard Christian Fellowship, and it really represents the way that American Christianity shifted after the Vietnam War towards with all of these shifts, towards a God who's experienced more intimately and immediately and more powerfully, more experientially. And so the Vineyard is one of these churches that grew up out of the hippie Christians, and turns out they had a big effect on the way that the American Christian church has changed. And this is a church that encourages you to experience God as interacting with you. So, I mean, God has always been understood the Christian God has always been understood as an interactive God. But sometimes it wasn't for everybody in the church. And this church really invites you to have a personal, intimate, and conversational relationship with God. So I went searching for a church, found the Vineyard, and then started going to the Vineyard.
And you're arguing that you observe the practice changing the mind.
Right.
And so you're not, it's not as if you're reading the Bible and memorizing the Bible and developing a set of ideas, but it's by doing the work of prayer that you then open your mind to God. Talk a little about that.
So I should say that the Bible's still pretty darn important.
Right,
what
right.
people are trying to do, in effect, which is something the early church fathers and the medieval clerics did, they're trying to replace ordinary human imagination with imagination of the Scriptures. But what people are doing is they're trying to experience God as talking back in what I would call these imaginal dialogues. So this is a term that somebody like Mary Watkins or Frederick Myers used to describe these conversations we have with other people who aren't present. You talk to your dog, you talk to yourself in the mirror, you talk to your mom who's not present, you talk to God. And they use the word imaginal to describe the fact that these inner voice conversations you've got to use your imagination to have those conversations, but the person having the conversation doesn't necessarily think that it is an imaginary experience. And so people are, when people come into a church like this, they seek to come to experience themselves as talking to God in prayer about anything, about their exam on Friday, about their bad date the previous night, about where they want to go on vacation. I mean, all the stuff you talk to a best friend about, even maybe more than you talk to a best friend about. And you really want to hear what God has to say about that. And so people experience that in many different kinds of ways. Sometimes people experience God very actively talking back and forth, and some people don't. But you're really trying to create this experience in which God is talking back, you recognize his voice in your mind, and that conversation you're having is not anchored in your imagination, it's rooted in the world in some ways. And so you've got to learn how to do that. And one of the things that, first of all, you've got to hold the conversation. So people have, the pastor says things like, have a cup of coffee with God. You have your cup of coffee, pour a second cup of coffee for God. Sit there at the table with the 2 cups of coffee. It'll help you have this conversation and just talk to God and see whether anything happens. For something to happen, you've got to pick out a thought in your mind that you might have thought as being your own mind, your own thought, but you learn to recognize as not self-authored, but other-authored. And so there are certain thoughts you have that are good candidates for this. So, you're talking to God and you're having this conversation and maybe you're sort of making up what God says, and then a word pops into your mind, Christy. I should call Christy. God wants me to call Christy. So there are these experiences. If a thought is spontaneous, you weren't thinking about it at the time, it feels louder than other thoughts, it's a better candidate to be a thought from God. If it's in accord with Scripture, so the pastor will say, if God tells you to jump off a bridge, it's not God. You've made a misidentification. The thought should make you feel good, because in this church, God is good and loving. He loves you. You should feel loved. And then you should kind of check it out with other people, get them to pray about it with you, or see whether you can confirm the experience in other ways. So that's the first thing that people do. They begin to discern how God is speaking to them. They practice. They use their imagination to represent God, and they develop very complicated ideas about when it's God and when it's not God. So if God is speaking to you in your mind, you are extremely, I know that secular liberals get very freaked out by that idea. George Bush said that God told him to invade Iraq, makes people very anxious. But but I thought that people were really pretty thoughtful about all the stuff that intervened between them and God. And then they had this really rich sense that they could be wrong, maybe it's not God, maybe it's their own desire, maybe God's not telling them to go out with so-and-so, maybe that they just want to do that. So anyway.
Well, how do we distinguish, because a secularist would look at this and say, well, either these people are being brainwashed on the one hand, or, very demeaning and say, they're crazy. They're like mentally ill people. How do you distinguish between these categories of a disciplined talking to God to somebody who hears voices and loses control on the one hand, and on the other hand, people who are being brainwashed, basically, by their minister?
I wouldn't call it brainwashed. It's, I think, people come to these churches, and sometimes the pastors of these churches will hold political views, or other people will hold political views that seem very comfortable to people, to newcomers to the church, and other observers become very agitated by those political views for, reasons that aren't surprising. The really kind of complicated question, I think, is the relationship between these practices where people are schooling and disciplining their mind and mental illness. And I think that in some crude sense, it's an easy distinction, because people who are mentally ill are often very unhappy. They feel that there's something going wrong, and their voices aren't telling them things that are consonant, they're not in accord with Scripture, is what a Christian would say, or they have very odd ideas. And often, particularly the person who is having these back and forth conversations who meets criteria for a diagnosis like schizophrenia, they have auditory experiences, and those auditory experiences are really pretty disturbing. So in general, you get folks in church, they're having inner voice conversations, they're seeking to sculpt those experiences so that they are helpful, healthful, happy, whatever. And very, very rarely do they have an auditory experience. If they do, turns out these are not so uncommon in the context of the general population. If they do, it's short, it's rare, and it's startling, but it's not distressing. So you're driving along the road, and God pipes up out of the back seat and says, "I will always be with you." Kind of great. You're a little startled, you're a little freaked out, but it's kind of great. Somebody who is psychotic and hearing voices, they are hearing not 6 words, but they're hearing paragraphs, conversations, voices all the time, 700 voices, a cloud of voices. And what those voices say is really pretty awful, usually. I mean, really terrible, terrible things. And so there's this very crude and obvious difference. What's messier is that line where people are probably meet criteria for schizophrenia, but they're really holding themselves together really well, and maybe they pass. And so we could talk more about that. I do think that these mind management techniques are at the heart of therapy. They're at the heart of mindfulness. These are techniques people use to manage their anxiety, and sometimes they help people who are vulnerable.
You make a comparison with what's called in fiction magical realism, that in some ways these communities you're talking about are versions of that are applied to real life.
Yeah. So if you think about magical realism, what it does as a technique, you drop in supernatural, magical stuff as if it's just there. You don't mark it as something special and different. That's how you're supposed to be experiencing God, as if He's right there. I know exactly where He is. And there's a sense that you're trying to create that for yourself. So people calmly and casually say things like, well, the other day God told me to X. The other day I was, really felt that God strongly said to me that I should do Y. And you're at church and you sing a worship song and you pause for God to talk to people. It's, and the idea is to really let God not be part of 45 minutes on every Sunday in which you think a little bit about the Scripture, but somehow an ongoing presence in your life. I started asking people whether God was like an imaginary friend. And, and I had in mind the 10-year-old or the 6-year-old with you have to keep a place at the table for the imaginary companion. And people would say, oh yes, but he's not imaginary. So he's kind of real in the world. And that's what you're aiming for. It's a complicated dance because it's hard not to notice that God is invisible. And in fact, adults behaved with God kind of the way young children behave with invisible friends. So you set a place at the table for God, and sometimes you don't. And maybe on Tuesday morning, it's really, really important to you that you've been experiencing God, and then you just kind of forget that He's there. And people have these. It takes a certain amount of work and effort to keep God always in mind. And that's kind of central to the action of this church. That's what they're trying to do, to get you to keep God always in mind.
Is there a lesson or two that you've learned from these experiences by observing these communities empathizing with them.
Yeah.
And these are communities that at least part of the population would be dismissive of and not understand the richness of what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, one of the bluntest lessons is that mind management, to use a secular term, works. And it works more effectively if you can carry God with you and believe that God is external to you. So if you think about what people are doing as being something that's a lot like therapy, you're kind of building this external being up, using all your best examples of loving, caring, thoughtful, wise people. And you've got the community around you, the real people around you, trying to persuade you that this representation, this God, this is really real. And you give yourself time to consult God when you're anxious or scared or something lousy has happened. And you allow this God to remind you that the world's good, you're loved, life is lovely, life is beautiful. That's kind of great. We have abundant evidence that going to church is good for you, on average, statistically. We don't understand this fully, but on average, you go to church once a week, you live 2 to 3 years longer. It's not quite as good as 30 minutes of exercise every day, but it's pretty darn good. That's really striking.
One final question. Is there something that secularists could learn from what you've studied as they deal with fundamentalists and evangelicals in politics? In other words, is there a lesson about that might create a common ground here in the future?
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple of lessons. First of all, the evangelical community is more complicated and more diverse than most secular liberals imagine. There are many green evangelicals, there are many liberal evangelicals, there are many evangelicals who voted for Obama. Not most evangelicals. But even in the last election, when 80% of the evangelical vote was for the Republican ticket, it's still like at 1 in 5. That's a lot more than most people imagine. Many evangelicals are more well-educated and more sophisticated than people imagine. And I think the basic lesson that the experience of God is not a mistaken belief that people carry with them because they're dumb, but a rich practice in which people are using an experience of God in order to feel more comfortable and at ease in the world. I think that's really important because I think it helps in having these conversations to see that there's something smart and sophisticated that somebody else is doing. The evangelical world is a very complicated world. And that's just a real truth about the world. And sometimes the things that people say get up my nose too. That doesn't mean that it's true for all of the community.
Well, on that note, Professor Luhrmann, I want to thank you for being here today on our program, a fascinating account of your intellectual journey. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.
And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.